welcome in this SEFI at Work seminar. This SEFI seminar is part of the series of Methods in Engineering Education Research. First of all, I want to warn you that we are recording this session. This is because we will distribute the part of the seminar where there is actually a presentation and part of the discussion to the SEFI website, so that also people that could not join our seminar live could still see the recording of the seminar and learn from it. So I want to remind you that this SEFI at Work series of engineering education research is from our special interest group. And in particular, this is being coordinated by Jan van der Veen. So Jan, wave. Yes, Jan. Esther Medina Ventura, who unfortunately could not attend the seminar today, and myself, Tine de Laat. So the goal of our seminar series is to focus on research methods in engineering education research. And we do this by giving the floor to researchers with high impact publication with solid methodology. So already being invited for this seminar, I think is a great honor and recognition for the work that has been done by the authors in our research field. So we want to challenge everyone to share their insight in engineering education research methods, and not just the kind of insights you could get from reading the paper, but also a little bit beyond. So we really want to share the researcher their honest experiences they had with the research methods that go beyond the textbook information. And you will be able to get this information today from well-respected authors in the field of engineering education research. Of course, this seminar is also always a good opportunity to connect with other people in the community. So also do not hesitate to join the discussions, to enter your opinions in the chat, maybe to share your camera picture if you want to see some familiar faces, or even if you want people to recognize you on the next SEFI conference. So today, it's our honor to have here Karolina and her co-authors who will be presenting Analyzing Student-Teacher Interactions in Challenge-Based Learning. And it's especially a big honor to have Karolina and her colleagues here because they have been winning the Best Paper Award in last year's SEFI conference. I also have seen that Jan is here, one of the co-authors, and Günther as well. Yes. And I have not seen, is it Michael?
It's Michael.
Michael. Okay, but it's great to also have the co-authors here. We are still planning our next seminars. So in particular, if you have suggestions for whom we could invite and who could join this honor of sharing their experiences in this series, you're also welcome to give some suggestions in the chat to me directly or to everyone to send us emails, the organizer, and we will, of course, be very glad to take into account all of your ideas. So now I'll give the floor to Karolina. I will stop sharing the presentation, and Karolina, you can share your screen.
All right. So hello, everyone. While I try to find my presentation, yes. I think this is it. All right. So if everything goes according to the plan, now you can see my first slide with the title of this presentation. So hello, everyone, and welcome, and thank you very much, Tina, Jan, and Esther for the invitation to present again the paper that we presented in Barcelona, the study we conducted on student-teacher interactions in challenge-based learning, but also to give us the opportunity to go a bit more in depth and share some insights about the methodology we used, choices we made, and also give us the opportunity to reflect on those choices and see what we could have done different next time. So, my plan for today is the following. First, I would like to introduce myself and my team, because this is a team project, and say a few things about the context of our research and the theoretical framework, because I think those two are quite important in order to have a better insight why we develop certain research questions. Then my suggestion is, if there are any questions or unclarities, we can make a brief pause for 1 or 2 clarifying questions, and then continue with the main part of this presentation, which will focus on the methodology that we used, the data collection, the data analysis and synthesis. Again, we can make probably a brief pause for me to breathe and drink water, and also if you have any clarifying question. And then we will wrap up with shortly with the findings of our study, some recommendations, especially for research, and we will have our discussion with all of you. So without further ado, first of all, my name is Karolina Doulougeri, that is already mentioned. I'm an educational researcher. I work in Eindhoven University of Technology, in Eindhoven School of Education more specifically. And I'm doing research on higher education since 2013, where I started my PhD in medical education, but I focus on engineering education since 2017, where I work in various projects related to student learning, to motivation. It's also, I think, important to mention that my background is in psychology. So these are the concepts that I'm interested in: motivation, self-regulated learning. And since 2020, I work together with my colleagues that I present you in a moment in the project of pedagogy in challenge-based learning. So in this project, we are 4, together with Jan Vermunt, Professor of Learning Science and Educational Innovation, Gunther Bombaerts, Assistant Professor of Ethics, and Michael Botz, Challenge-Based Learning Program Manager. We are all working in Eindhoven University. We collaborate in this project that is now in the 3rd year to answer some important questions related to challenge-based learning. More specifically, the overarching questions that we focus are: how do students learn or regulate their learning in challenge-based learning individually, but also as a group? And also how we can achieve the optimal balance between students' autonomy and teacher guidance. So this is the framework, this is the overarching objective of our study. Now, a few things about challenge-based learning. For those that are maybe not so familiar, challenge-based learning is an educational concept, is getting a lot of popularity, at least in our university, but I believe in general, in engineering education. And currently in our university, we have a lot of initiatives and educational experiments that focus on how we can understand better and also improve this educational approach. And if I had to summarize the key characteristics of challenge-based learning, I would say it is an active learning pedagogy, so students need to actively participate in the learning process. It is guided and by open-ended and real-life challenges that are the drivers for students' learning. Learning happens in a collaborative environment, and students are in the lead of their learning. And this is an expression that is good to remember, because that also justifies the theoretical framework we later adopted. So students are expected to be in charge and show proactivity while learning in challenge-based learning. So this is how challenge-based learning looks in context. This is a nice figure developed by our research community. So in the center, you see a challenge and a group of students coming from different disciplines. And around them, we have different actors like challenge owners, experts, coaches, that they all support the students from the beginning till the end of their project by coaching them, by providing them content knowledge, guiding them through the process in order to develop their own unique solution to the challenge that they are assigned. Why is that relevant for us? First of all, the open-endedness of the challenges is something that is very relevant for this project, that as I will explain also later. Secondly, it's important to remember that our research, it follows a very naturalistic context. So we do research on real classes, or anyway, wherever challenge-based learning taking place, like an innovation space or something like that. So we follow the natural development of the course. And thirdly, what we do, we frame it as flanking research, which means that we aim to both develop knowledge on challenge-based learning, but also to improve educational practice. So to gain insights that will help later teachers to improve challenge-based learning education. So The theoretical background of our study. As I said, students are in the lead of their learning. For us, this is connected with the theoretical concept that guides our research, which is self-regulated learning, which basically describes this proactive process that students are engaged to when they study. And when we talk about self-regulated learning, I think it's important to identify three processes that, at least for us, are very relevant, as described by the theoretical framework by Vermunt and Verloop. So we focus on cognitive, metacognitive, and motivational learning activities that students are engaging during challenge-based learning. Cognitive activities is how students interact with the content of the challenge or the course. Metacognitive has to do with the working process that they engage, like how they set goals, how they plan their activities. And motivational is how they regulate their emotions, their motivation, their proactivity during the course. What we know from a systematic literature review that we conducted on challenge-based learning in engineering education is that very often, even though we expect students to show these self-regulated learning skills, very often they are not having these kind of skills, especially when they encounter challenge-based learning for the first time. So for us, this is the first important thing to keep in mind. So in order to support students that have no prior experience with challenge-based learning, or they have no developed self-regulated learning skills, we believe that the role of the teacher is very important in such a context. And that was also highlighted by the systematic review we conducted. The teacher has many roles in challenge-based learning. It can be the course coordinator, it can be the coach, which is actually the most important kind of role that a teacher can have in challenge-based learning to support students. But students, as I said before, are expected to be in the lead. This, as you can imagine, can create quite some friction, because on one hand, students are not used to so much autonomy and so much initiative. And on the other hand, by design, a teacher who engages and designs their course in challenge-based learning, they expect students to be in the lead. So we can identify already friction between the student learning strategies that students are used to implement while learning and the teacher teaching strategies that now have to adapt to challenge-based learning. So in CBL, this kind of uncertainty that is also relevant to open-ended challenges can lead to this friction. And we believe that friction can either promote learning or can hinder it. And again, we build on a theoretical framework by Vermunt and Verloop that define two types of friction. Constructive friction, where there is a discrepancy between what students are able to do and regulate their learning and the teacher's regulation activities, but there is this discrepancy at the end is mitigated by the teacher. So the teacher supports the student, guides the student, so the student becomes self-regulated learner. On the other hand, this friction can be destructive, and that happens when the student feels that they cannot regulate their learning, but they also feel unsupported by the teacher. In that sense, the student cannot perform the activities that are expected by him or her. So bringing this together, I hope I gave you an overview of what is challenge-based learning and what is our theoretical framework. The research question we wanted to answer in this study were, first of all, what incidents of friction do students experience in challenge-based learning courses? And how does this interaction between the student and the teacher influence students' development of self-regulated learning? And maybe something else to keep in mind for the discussion is the word development here, and whether we can talk about development of self-regulated learning. Are there any questions so far? This is my first post to drink water. No? Okay, that
all clear.
I take that as a good sign that everything is clear, so I move on. Okay, let's talk about the context of our study before talking about the methodology. So we decided to do a study in one of the CBL courses that are taking place in our university. And in general, our CBL courses are quite small, I must say. This was also a small course with 43 students. It was an ethics and data analytics course for first-year students. So Most of our students did not have experience with challenge-based learning. It was a course quite heavy with 10 ECTs for 10 weeks, so it was quite intense. Students could choose one of 3 challenges. They were all real-life challenges, open-ended. They had to work in groups of 4, and they received coaching sessions every week along the process. So, coming to the methodology now, what was the best way to answer a research question? What method would be optimal? We spent quite some time to think what is the optimal way to answer a research questions, because we had several objectives. First of all, we wanted to collect data that were quite rich in content. So we wanted in-depth information about the student experience in challenge-based learning, but also we wanted to be able to identify the friction that we talked before. So what kind of data would give us this information? Secondly, we wanted to be able to do both within person and between person analysis. So we were not only interested in comparing students, but we wanted also to be able to trace the development that I mentioned earlier of the students within a certain course. Thirdly, we wanted to align our research with the educational design of the course, because we didn't want to overload students with too much extra research. So we wanted to make sure we can use some information that will be also useful for the students from educational perspective. So we went to the literature and we read a lot about and found very useful information in one paper by Eindhoven with taxonomy and classification of different measures and instruments to measure student learning. And we concluded that in our case, the best way to measure what we wanted to measure was an offline instrument. So an instrument that will assess student experience after it has happened, so not during the course, because that would be, in our view, would be a bit disruptive to ask students to reflect on their friction while they're experiencing it. And we wanted also an instrument that will not be, let's say, a self-reported questionnaire that mostly measures an aptitude, but we wanted to measure more events, or to make sure we stay very close to the context, to challenge-based learning. So taking all this into consideration, we came up with a decision to use a weekly learning portfolio for our data collection purposes, because that would be a way to trace every week how students experience the course, and that would give us the biggest chance to also identify the friction in students' reflections. So we introduced this learning portfolio, and we, in order, as I said, to maximize the acceptance from the students and minimize the time they have to spend in their research, we integrated this learning portfolio as part of the course. So students had anyway every week as part of their course to complete this reflective portfolio, and we were providing them some guiding questions. You can read them in the screen, but for today, the one that I will mostly focus on is the one that is kind of highlighted. So first of all, what was the learning experience that happened this week, but also were there others involved in this learning experience? If yes, who were they and how did they influence your learning? So we thought that this question would give us some insight about whether there were frictions, but also who was involved in this friction. It's important also to mention that students were not just writing this reflection and forgetting about it. There was a coach every week reading all these reflections, and then in a group setting discussing with the students. And we made that decision because we wanted students to understand the value of reflection. We wanted them not to see it as a boring thing that many engineering students might experience, but we wanted them to understand that there is value if you do that consistently. And for that, we had a coach that was also discussing these reflections with them. So how we collected data. So we waited, of course, for the course to be completed, which meant 10 weeks. Of course, we had an ethics review board approval for this study. So we went back to the students and asked them whether we can use the same portfolio for research purposes. And we had a very good response rate. 39 out of 43 gave us permission to use this portfolio. So that was great. And that ended up with 380 weekly reflections. And just to give you an idea of how long the reflections were, mostly were around 1 page. So 380 pages of data to analyze. Now, let's make a pause and look back to certain choices that we made. Definitely using a portfolio and using this approach has some disadvantages. I will start with the disadvantages. First of all, it's very subjective, and the way students answer these reflections is very, very diverse. And the depth they go is also very often varying among students. So it's very hard to compare those reflections. It's very hard to find one way to consistently approach all the reflections because they are quite different. Also, the style of the students answer the questions is quite different. And of course, we need to consider time. It can be quite time consuming for students to write those reflections, and sometimes also feel a bit redundant because it's on a weekly basis, but they don't have something that they consider very important to reflect every week. It is time consuming for the teachers, of course, because they had to read those reflections and have the coaching sessions. And also for us as researchers, we ended up with a lot of data. So this is something to keep in mind when thinking to adopt a learning portfolio in your studies. On the other hand, there are advantages that I also need to mention at this stage. First of all, it aligns with our educational purposes, so it really encourages students to reflect, and you could see a qualitative improvement to the reflections of the students. It also enhances their self-awareness about why I do that and how I become maybe better to this. It's very personal, so students really, you can see their style, you can see the particular way they write. So I think this is really nice. It allows us, what I said, to track this development throughout the course and to do the analysis that we intended within person, but also between people. And also, it's also an easy way to collect data and analyze them because they are ready. It's not like interviews or videos that you have to transcribe them and you have to process all this information. The portfolio is ready, written to be analyzed. So it is also something to keep in mind if you're interested. Now, how we analyze this data? We started with trying to organize them because there were quite many. So we came with 3 levels of organization. First, we organized them by student. So every line represents 1 student. So what happened in the reflection of every student per week. So like that, we could do the within-person analysis that we were interested. We could also group all the students of one group together to see whether there are similarities or differences in the way they experience the course, students of the same group, and also the last one per week. So we could go vertically and see, okay, what are the most important themes per week happening in this course? So that gives us a lot of possibility. It can also be quite overwhelming because you have to switch between different perspectives, between different levels of analysis. So making some choices is quite important. And I must admit, I spent quite a lot of time playing around with its data and understanding them. So even though we had a clear objective, it can drag you and can consume a lot of time when you work with these kind of data sets. So how we analyze the data? We use we also describe it in the paper, a combination of inductive and deductive coding. And it's a very iterative process. So it's a process that develops over and over, of course, together in collaboration with my research team. We chose to do a thematic analysis. So we first try to get an understanding of what are our data and try to generate some initial codes, especially for the learning experiences. But then we decided that what worked for us in our research question is to use the theoretical framework that was guiding our research and try to identify in every reflection the cognitive, metacognitive, and emotional motivational aspects of learning that we were interested. So to show you how that looked, there was a process with multiple steps. There were initially 2 knockout criteria, as I call them, or inclusion criteria for this analysis. First of all, the question was, is there in this reflection an interaction between student and teacher reported? That was quite critical for us because our research question focused on that. If yes, that reflection was included. The second question was, is there a friction reported? And we can have a big discussion about what we consider friction in this study. So if there was an interaction and friction, this reflection was included. Then, a second step, we had to categorize the type of friction. It's a friction at the cognitive level that has to do with understanding the content. It has to do with metacognitive aspects, like how to organize my studies, or it is at the emotional or motivational level. Then in the third step, we were coding the teacher regulation, if existed. So what kind of activities the teacher did to support the student, again, in these three levels. And finally, we were trying to identify whether there is a self-regulation reported. So what the student did as an outcome of this. And here is where the inductive coding was very useful, because those are large categories. Doesn't mean anything, the cognitive, the metacognitive, and the emotional, if you don't make it so specific. So the inductive coding then helped us to go back to all these broad categories and identify what made different codes similar or different in order to make our final scheme. And I think this is quite abstract, so I have prepared an example for you. So this is a reflection that we worked with, and you don't have to read it right now because we will go ahead and code it together. So here is the color coding. I did that to save some time, but I will read it through so you can see our way of thinking. So I start from the beginning. I did not know where to start. That for us was a signal of friction, because it shows that the student has a difficulty to do something, in this case, to start. And we think that this is at the metacognitive level. So I don't know regarding the working process where to start. So I asked for help during the TA session. So that for us, it is the other knockout criterion that there is an interaction. So this reflection is good to be analyzed. Then TA and some fellow students explained the concept of business ethics. For us, this is a teacher regulation at the cognitive level, because the teacher is explaining a concept, business ethics, and gave me the hint to start with writing down the vision of diagame. Diagame was the challenge. There, we believe there is a second regulation activity at the metacognitive level, that the teacher supports planning of activities by giving a hint to the student. So I could write an ethical issue based on diagame's vision. We think that this is a sign of the self-regulation at the cognitive level, because the student, after receiving this regulation, goes ahead and applies the theory, and that continues to the other big blue part where the student elaborates to how they apply the theory. However, when finishing my first draft, I still doubted if I did implement business ethics in our report as it should be. For us, this is a second friction in the same reflection, and this time at the cognitive level. So the student did what he was expected to do, and now he's doubting whether this is correct. So I asked the ethics teacher for feedback. This is a second interaction. And the teacher, he said that he did not see reference to business ethics materials, and I could be a lot shorter and say the same. So the teacher regulation at this time, it's at the cognitive level again, but by providing feedback to how the student can improve the report or whatever material document he had produced. So this is how we went in this analysis. The thing that I didn't mention is whether the friction is constructive or destructive here. So in both cases, we consider this friction constructive. Why? Because there is an active regulation reported by the teacher, and there is some reference to how the student proceed after that. So we believe that the friction was resolved. So this is just an example of how we went ahead with our analysis. And I must say it's a quite time-consuming process with a lot of debates. Then, of course, we took all these different themes that we identified and codes, and we tried to synthesize them. So under the topic of friction, what different types of cognitive friction we can see, what types of metacognitive friction we can see, and what types of motivational friction. Then we did the same for teacher regulation, again, following the same levels, and student regulation. And here, of course, a question is, can you assess development from this kind of student regulation? This is something to reflect during our discussion. So we took every, let's say, reflection, we deconstructed it, and this is the outcome when we synthesized back everything. What we missed there. So I think reflecting back to what we did afterwards, that was a very useful exercise for us, a very insightful study, but I feel we've missed first the context of challenge-based learning, so that could have been in any kind of course. We missed the temporal development because there is no indication of time there, and the within-person analysis. There is also another thing that we missed, and that was because the framework we used was focusing on the individual. So we had to use inductive coding because there were a lot of references to social regulation at the group level. And these were, if we were only strictly using our theoretical framework, would have been completely ignored. But because we recognized that there were quite many, we used inductive coding to also add this social aspect of regulation in our overall analysis. But I think this is a good example of why it's important to use both approaches when you analyze this complex data. Any questions? Because I'm about to finish this presentation. Good.
There were some questions in the chat, but I think these are more like for the discussion already. Awesome. So I think you can continue. Yeah, I'm gonna finish. So a summary of the findings. The findings are also can be found in the paper. We think that the uncertainty is quite prevalent in challenge-based courses, and friction can be associated with this, especially if students have no prior experience. We don't consider friction to be a bad thing, though. Students need to balance regulation of learning at multiple levels, so it is understandable that there will be some friction, but for us this is a driver of learning as long as the teacher is there to support students' development and make this friction constructive. And also it's important to mention that students gradually will recognize the importance of being self-regulated learners and being proactive and be really in the lead of their learning. Now, a few recommendations focusing mostly on research and methodology. We think that our approach worked for our purposes, but we would like also to recommend people to also consider other approaches to assess student-teacher interactions that are capturing the real-time interactions, like video recordings, or I'm looking forward to hear other suggestions. However, we need to consider how we can also combine different methods and whether that is realistic and what is valid, depending on the research purposes. But for me, the struggling part is how to align the information of these different methodologies to one common, coherent whole, because it's easy to focus on one data set and then have other sources of information that you never use. So if you have ideas of how to really integrate them, that would be also really useful. And from our experience, we really would like to recommend not to focus only between the difference between students as we did, but also take a better look how students develop during these courses, and also not focus only on the individual, but also consider challenge-based learning as a learning environment that encourages social learning. So social aspects are also very relevant. And I think, yeah, these are some of the references I mentioned today. Yeah, thank you very much for your attention. And